Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Paul, for what purpose does he rise? Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend.
Without objection.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of Mr. Goodling's amendment to prohibit the expenditure of federal funds for President Clinton's national testing scheme. Mr. Goodling's amendment will prevent the Education Department from developing a national test unless authorized to do so by Congress. While I share Mr. Goodling's concerns that the administration should not take such a drastic step as developing national testing without congressional authorization, and I thank Mr. Goodling for all his leadership in fighting for this amendment, the fact is the federal government has no constitutional authority to develop national testing even with congressional approval. National testing is another significant step toward total nationalization of education. National testing will ultimately lead to fulfillment of the dream of the enemies of the constitutional system of local and parental control of education, the de facto creation of a national curriculum. Mr. Chairman, the administration claims that the testing program would be voluntary. However, I remind my colleagues that this is the same administration that considers the Goals 2000 a voluntary program. Despite the numerous times Goals 2000 legislation uses the term shall and must in describing state functions. Furthermore, whether or not schools are directly ordered to administer the tests, schools will face pressure to do so as colleagues and employers inevitably begin to use national tests as the standard by which students are measured for college entrance exams and entry-level jobs. At the very least, schools would soon find federal and perhaps even state funding dependent on their voluntary participation in the national testing programs. When all, or at least the majority of the schools in administering national tests, the test will then be the standard by which all schools shall be measured. Those schools whose students did poorly on the national test would be labeled as doing a poor job of educating children. Educators would react to this pressure to ensure students scored highly on the national test by teaching the test. That is, structuring curriculum so students can learn those subjects and only those subjects covered by the national test. As University of Kansas professor John Poggio remarked in February, quote, "What gets tested is what will be taught," close quote. Government bureaucrats would control the curriculum of every school in the nation, and they would be able to alter the curriculum at will by altering the national test. Private schools and homeschools will be affected as well, as performance on the national test become the standard by which student performance is judged. Those in private and homeschools will face increasing pressure to participate in national testing and shape what is taught, the criteria of their tests. The Department of Education has already admitted its ultimate aim is for a national curriculum. According to a United Press international story on the National Assessment of Educational Progress reprinted in the Santa Rosa Press-Democrat in May, quote, "The Education Department hopes the kinds of questions involved in the voluntary test will shape the science that is taught." Mr. Chairman, under the United States Constitution, the enumerated powers of the federal government simply do not include education. Yet the Clinton administration's national test proposal will inevitably result in federal bureaucrats dictating what every child in America will be taught. National testing represents another giant step in the centralizing of American education and a giant step away from America's constitutional republic. I therefore urge my colleagues to join me in opposing all moves to implement a national testing scheme, starting by supporting Mr. Goodling's amendment to prohibit the expenditure of federal funds to develop and administer a national testing program without explicit authorization from Congress. And I yield back the balance of my time.